Okay.
Guru Brahma, Guru Vishnu, Guru Devo Maheshwara, Guru Sakshat Parabrahma, Tasmai Shri Gurave Namaha. Om Shanti, Shanti, Shanti. Okay, so this is the third class of the introduction to the Srimad Bhagavad Gita. We had discussed in the second chapter where the teaching begins in 211, how according to this text, the self in everyone is unborn, undying, all-pervading, indestructible, unchanging, all of those qualities. It's not born, it doesn't die, it's always present, it's not in time. And that was taught dogmatically, but that's very different than the idea of the self in religion, where you're a soul that either gets born when the body is born, and when the body dies, you go either to heaven or hell, that kind of self. This self is unborn, undying. It never had a body because it's all pervading. So and there's only one, because if it's all pervading, there can't be more than one thing that pervades everything. So this is the self that was taught. If a person realizes that, he grieves no more. That was the claim. The purpose of the Gita is to remove the ignorance about ourselves and to remove the grief that delusion, that misconception was causing. And that's the purpose of the Gita. So let me begin by backing up just a drop. I want to distinguish the difference between this teaching in the Gita and what would be called philosophy, as we know it in the West, as well as religion, as we know it in the West. For one thing is, this teaching is not a proselytizing religion. Nobody is trying to convert everybody over because they know the true word of God and ours is the right way and you should follow our way. That's not even though the Abrahamic religions, because they believe they have the word, they want to share the good news. Vedanta is not like that. It's an inquiry into the nature of the self, about a fact that anybody who's willing is able to investigate and see for themselves whether this fact is verifiable. So that's one thing, that this Gita is not like a book that you have to take out and convert people to this teaching. It's not like that. In fact, the way the tradition goes is that the student has to, very difficult, he has to seek out a teacher. The teacher is not seeking out students. It's not about getting a bigger crowd or anything like that. It's about one sincere student looking for a teacher. So that's another reason why this type of teaching can't be like the Hare Rama, Hare Krishna, where everybody can dance and sing and get together, because it's a very inward journey. It's a very introspective type of investigation, and everyone's not even ready to do that type of thing. But it's not a proselytizing religion. That's one thing. The second thing is that because the way most Westerners, the way they've understood this teaching of the ancient Indian teaching of non-duality, the way it's come down to us, the way it came to the West, was that there were people like Ramakrishna Paramahamsa and Swami Vivekananda and all of the Ramakrishna monks that were in those traditions. They were very important in bringing this idea of Vedanta, non-duality, these teachings to the West, America. So what happened was that someone like Ramakrishna, who was not a student of this teaching, who was not a scholar, in fact, he was illiterate, whatever he was able to teach, he came up with some very peculiar ideas, such as all religions are one. It is said that Ramakrishna practiced Judaism and realized what the Torah calls Yahweh is the same as the Upanishads. They call it just Atman or Brahman. He practiced Christianity and he realized that the God of the Bible was the same God as the Gita and the Upanishads. Then supposedly he practiced Islam and what they call Allah. He realized by practicing that Allah was the same thing that the Gita. So the idea was truth is one, but different religions just call it by different names. So this idea, which is very ecumenical and this way religions don't have to fight, became a popular idea about Vedanta. Books came out. One book was called The Sermon on the Mount, according to Vedanta, that Christ saying about me and my Father are one, I am that I am. These type of teachings were Vedantic, and therefore they were really just teaching the same thing in different words. This idea is totally wrong. What the Gita is teaching has nothing to do with the God of the Bible or the Torah or the Quran. It has nothing to do with any religious dogmas of any kind. So this idea, once they had this idea, that then you could just follow Judaism and that would take you to understand your true self or God. Or you could follow Islam and you'd realize the same truth. Vivekananda, who is the real one who came over for the Parliament of Religions and introduced Vedanta to the West, he took that idea that there are many paths and truth is one, but you can go through it through all the religions will equally take you there, because Ramakrishna practiced all of them and he said that. So Vivekananda took it further and said, there are many paths, truth is one, but the paths that lead to it are many. And he basically broke those paths up into 4 different paths, all parallel, independent paths, and depending on a person's personality, characteristics, they could decide which of the 4 paths suits them, and that path for them will take you to liberation. But for another person, they could follow another path, and that would take you, because the paths are many, but the truth is one. Don't mistake the fingers for the moon. They're all just paths, and they all will take you there. Each one is a valid path. So for the person who's active, the way the Bhagavad Gita was presented was that for the active person, the person who wants to engage in the world, he could practice karma yoga. He could make his actions into a type of yoga, and that would bring him to liberation. For the more emotional people, they can fall in love with God, and through that selfless surrender and love, they can get the same goal that the karma yogi, this is called bhakti yoga, And then there was another path, and that was for the people that like to meditate, whose minds, they want to bring it under control and examine their minds. Those people, they are taught Raja Yoga, the yoga of meditation. And then for the intellectual people, the people who like to analyze and philosophize, they could do Jnana Yoga, the yoga of knowledge. And that these were the four major yogas that are taught in the Bhagavad Gita. And you could decide which one, and they will take you to the goal. This became a very popular idea, just like all religions take you to the same goal. You could even say, oh, the Buddha, they just call it emptiness, but we call it fullness. It's just a different name for the same thing. That idea, Jainism, whatever they believe, ultimately, it's because all the teachings are teaching one truth. This idea is totally bogus. It's absolutely wrong. And if you understand it that way, not only can't you understand the Bhagavad Gita, it'll make no sense at all, you can't understand the Vedantic teaching. Just to summarize, in Vedanta, in the Gita, this Gita is a Vedantic text. The only problem is a misconception that the whole duality, the whole samsara is caused by a misconception. They call that ignorance. We're ignorant about our true self, and we've taken it to be something other than what we truly are. This is the cause of samsara in Vedanta, in the Gita, which I'll try to bring out. He already said the self is unborn, but everybody says, I am born. If the self is really unborn, then this idea that I'm born must be a misconception. It must merely be a wrong idea, a confusion about who I truly am. And if that's the case, the only thing that will remove this ignorance, this misconception, is by getting the correct knowledge of the self. There's no other way. The Upanishad says, Na anya panta vidyuteyanaya. There is no other path other than knowing that. So karma yoga, doing actions, will never remove this ignorance. The purpose of karma yoga is not to remove ignorance. Meditation will never remove ignorance, no matter what you do. Meditate on a thing, meditate on a mantra, meditate on a symbol, meditate on your breath. Just watch everything, don't watch everything, stop your thoughts, don't stop your thoughts. Whatever it is, that will never put an end to the ignorance. And this idea of falling in love with God, being devotional to God, is based on the idea that that God must be other than you. It can't put an end to that ignorance. If bhakti means being devoted to something outside of yourself, then that type of bhakti is in duality. It lives there and it ends there. It can never put an end to the ignorance. So this idea that there are four paths and they can all bring you to liberation is not the correct understanding of Vedanta. But people like, there's a very popular Swamiji now that's teaching the Gita, and he teaches these four paths and says, if you want, you can do it through meditation, but also you can do it through analysis, jnana yoga, or as though it's up to you. You could pick the path. That's not how this Bhagavad Gita or the Upanishads or Vedanta is to be understood. So, with that preface, the teaching is that the self is unborn, undying, all-pervading. And then he says to him, fire can't cut it, the swords can't cut it, fire can't burn it, the water can't wet it, the wind can't dry it. It's uncuttable, unburnable, indestructible. The self in everyone can't be destroyed. Avinashi tu tatvidi. Know that to be indestructible, by which all this is pervaded. That self which pervades everything. It's not just limited to this individual body, but that consciousness, the true self, is not limited to any shape or form. You should know that all the forms are pervaded by that, yinam midam sarvam tatam, by which all this is pervaded. Man attains perfection by realizing that. That's the verse there. So after that, he tells Arjuna, but you should fight. You should enter into the battle because you're not qualified for this wisdom. You don't have the qualifications. You are other than the person who can understand that. You are identified with this body, mind, and senses. And so for you, Arjuna, I'm telling you to engage in the battle. For the ignorant people, which is all of us, the Gita is addressed to ignorant people, people who think I do. That idea that I'm the doer, based on that idea, there's a teaching, and he's telling Arjuna, don't sit and do nothing, do your duty, engage in the action, but don't be attached to the results. Why is that? Because if you're going to be a yogi, if you're going to have a mind that can understand this teaching that the self is unborn, unchanging, you need a yogi's mind. What does that mean? A mind that's yoked, that's turned towards that truth. That's what the yogi means, in fact. The mind getting joined to that, and in fact, merging into that. That's called yoga. That's the only real yoga. There's just one yoga in the whole Bhagavad Gita. People think there's karma yoga, bhakti yoga, dhyana yoga. But those are just yogas in a secondary sense because they lead to real yoga. Yoga means to join with that reality and become one with it. That's the only yoga. It's one. This yoga I taught, Krishna says. He doesn't say these yogas. This yoga, singular. There's only one yoga. Karma becomes a yoga because it leads to the real yoga. Meditation becomes a yoga because it leads to the real yoga. Bhakti becomes a yoga because it leads to the real yoga. So all of these teachings about karma, he's telling him to act, to do your actions, and then he begins to tell him how to do it. So let me read a few verses in the middle of the second chapter. He says, weapons can't cut it, fire can't burn it, neither water wet it. This self cannot be cut, burnt, wet, dried. It's eternal, all-pervading, stable, immovable, and everlasting. This self is said to be unmanifest. The senses can't see it, the eyes can't perceive it, the ears can't hear it, the skin can't touch it. It's unmanifest. It's unthinkable. Whatever you think of, achintyam. The self is not an object of any thought, achintyam. It is immutable. The self has no karma. It never does anything. It's not in space. It can't move from one place to another. Immutable. Knowing it to be such, if you have that knowledge, you should not grieve. When you know the self to be like that, you will not grieve anymore. And then from 26 through up to about 29 or 30, he gives some worldly examples why Arjuna should fight. He's a warrior. People will say, oh, you quit the battle out of fear. All of these worldly ideas, he says. And then, after giving him all of the reasons why he should fight, both from the point of view of if you want to get liberation, then you fight. And I'm going to tell you how to fight so that you can make that karma into a yoga. If you really want the supreme good, because you can't just stop acting, because if that's the case, you'll be what's called just in lethargy. You'll do nothing and you'll go nowhere. So then he says, this knowledge, so coming now to 239, forgetting about all the worldly considerations, this knowledge that I taught you about the self, Arjuna, this is Raja Vidya Rajaguhyam. This is the royal knowledge. This is the kingly knowledge. This is the knowledge by knowing which nothing remains to be known. This knowledge about the self, which is the only unchanging reality. Rajaguhyam. It is the royal secret. It's a secret because the mind can't think of it and the senses can't perceive it. Even though it's always present, ever shining, and the closest thing to you, it's a secret for those whose minds are extrovert. This knowledge that I've taught you about the self, Eshate Abhihita Samkhya. This is called Samkhya. The complete and full knowledge about the self is called Samkhya. This, what I've taught you, the Samkhya, the discriminative knowledge that the self is not changing. So whatever is changing is not the self. The body is changing, it's not the self. The senses are changing, it's not the self. The minds, the thought, the emotions, the perceptions, the ego, all phenomena are changing, coming and going, appearing and disappearing. They can't be the self. And the self is what is not changing, ever present, everlasting. That's called Samkhya. But now I'm going to teach you yoga. That yoga by which, Partha, you'll be freed from bondage. Karma bandhanam prahasyasi. You will throw off the bondage of karma. I already taught you Samkhya, the knowledge of the self. But now I'm going to teach you yoga, by which you'll be freed from the bondage of karma. So this is the beginning of the next portion of the teaching. He taught him the nature of the self, unborn, undying, unchanging, immutable, indestructible, all-pervading. And so in 40, he says, here in this sphere of karma yoga, he's now going to teach him karma yoga. He already taught him jnana yoga, the yoga which is consisting of the knowledge of the self. That's called jnana yoga, the knowledge of the self. That very knowledge is yoga, because when you know the self, you are the self. Because you're already the self, it seemed like you were not because of ignorance. So that knowledge removes that misconception and you remain as you've always been. That's called yoga. You merge and remain one with the self. It's kind of like the space in a pot merging in the infinite space, although really there's just one space, there's no merging. So then he says, So you should know these two types of two paths. One is called Samkhya. That's called Jnana Yoga. The yoga of the true knowledge about the self, unborn, undying, ever all-pervading, ever-present, indestructible. That's called Jnana Yoga. For the person who's not able to understand this teaching, who feels that I am this, I am a doer, a knower, an enjoyer, for that person, I'm going to teach you karma yoga, how to make action into a yoga so that you'll be freed from the bondage of karma. So then in 42 and 43, the Gita makes fun of people who are doing actions so that they can get the fruit of the action. Even these Vedic actions, there are people that are performing sacrifices, offering things into the fire, like ghee and coconuts and mantras, and they think that they're going to get some heavenly reward. This idea is criticized in the Bhagavad Gita in a very beautiful way. And then he says, this whole Veda, which is filled with all of these different duties, that's all the Veda is. It tells you what to do and not to do. Be free from this Veda. It says the scope of the Vedas is these threefold nature. They're all within the realm of duality. Go beyond these. He who has mastered the self rises above all dualities. So the Gita is teaching that the person who realizes the self is beyond all of nature, the three gunas that constitutes nature. He's beyond that when he realizes the self. This person who realizes the self, for him, this is 46, for the knower of Brahman, Brahman means the self, the absolute, unborn, all-pervading reality is Brahman. For a knower of Brahman who has realized the ultimate truth, there is so much profit from all the Vedas, from all the religious scriptures, from all the do's and don'ts and prohibitions and injunctions, as there is profit from a pond when you're in the middle of an uncontrollable flood. That's the example. The point is that for someone who's realized the self, he doesn't need any Vedas, any scriptures, any teachers, they have no value to him whatsoever. The person who's realized the self, even the Veda becomes no Veda. Even the scriptures become no scriptures. He's realized the self that's the non-dual reality. So these things are of no value to him anymore. But for the person who hasn't realized this, like Arjuna, who's like us, this next verse is the cornerstone of the teaching of the Gita. This is a critical verse, so I'll just spend a minute with this. This verse here, 47, Karmani eva adhikaraste. There's two lines to this verse, and each verse is chopped in half. 8 beats, 8 beats. Karmani eva adhikaraste. Arjuna, your qualification is not to be a knower of Brahman. Your qualification is to do your duty. Karmani eva adhikaraste. In actions, that's what you're qualified for. So you must act. That's the first part. If you don't act, you'll just be in laziness, lethargy, and what's called tamas. Tamas is darkness, ignorance, and you'll never get out of it. So get up and enter into the battle. You're a warrior. This battle is justified. It's a righteous battle. Nothing could be better for a warrior than a righteous battle. So enter into the battle. Your adhikar, who you are, Arjuna, one of the great warriors, you enter into the battle. This is over the shoulders to us. Enter into the battle of life. Don't be afraid. Courageously enter into the battle. Do your duty. But the next part says, Ma paleshu kadachana. But you should never be attached to the fruit of that action. That's the second part. Because if you just do actions, this has to do with understanding a little bit about the qualities of the mind. They divided it into 3 sections, just like the rest of the world they saw in 3 classifications. Tamas, Rajas, Sattva, the 3 gunas, the 3 qualities. So the mind that was lethargic, filled with ignorance and confusion, that was called tamas. When the mind is like that, that's a tamasic mind. To overcome that, engage in the battle, you must act. Then action is called rajas. You overcome the tamas by acting in the battle. Karmani eva adhikaraste. By doing actions, you'll overcome the tamas, the laziness, the lethargy, the darkness. By engaging, you'll become rajas. But rajas is also a bondage. So how to become sattvic, how to make the mind pure. The next part says, Ma paleshu kadachana. Your adhikar is for action, but not for attachment to the fruit of that action. If you perform your actions without the desire for the fruit, Arjuna, everybody else, then that action will make the mind sattvic. What does that mean? When the mind is attached to the fruit, when we get what we wanted, we become elated. When we don't get what we want, we become dejected. This is called sukha dukkha, sukhi dukhi. This is the ordinary mind of people. They're doing things to get what they like and avoid what they dislike, natural. And when they get what they like, they're happy, but it's unavoidable. They sometimes get what they don't like, and then they're not so happy. And this goes on. But the yogi's mind, Krishna is saying, to make it sattvic, get your mind off of the fruit of the work. That's the next stage. So the first stage is to do action. That'll come over the tamas. But the action will make you rajas. To overcome that, you have to do it in a particular way. How? With no attachment to the fruit of that action. That's one part of karma yoga. If you're not doing it for the fruit, then what should you do it for? You do it as an offering. My action, I'm yoking it to that supreme being from which all actions come and by which all actions are pervaded, to that supreme being, which is my own self. I'm going to offer it up to my own true self, that supreme being, Paramatma, with no care about the fruit. That'll make the mind sattvic. So that's the second part of the first line. The next line says, Ma karma palahetu bur, and don't be the cause of the fruit of any action. Now, let me try to explain this. In the second part, you do the action, but don't be attached to the fruit. In the next part, let me just say one more thing about, if you perform your actions with no desire for the fruit, because you perform the action, the fruit is going to come. You did it. The fruit's going to come, whether you want it or not, or are worried about it or not. But when the fruit comes, the yogi's mind is equanimity. But the fruit is coming. It doesn't free you from the fruit. It just frees you from your reaction to it because you're not attached to the fruit. But in the next stage, there's no idea, there's no attachment, because whenever you do an action, please follow, whenever you do an action, if you examine, first there's a subtle thing, it's called the sankalpa. You have a thought about something, and then it kind of develops into a desire, and then you do the action, and then you get the result of the action. So the very thought to do it, the very desire to do it, the very doing of it, and the very fruit of it, you're the witness of all of that. Then you're freed from the fruit of the action. You didn't do it. In the second stage, you're the actor, but you're not doing it for the fruit, you're doing it with an attitude offering to him. But in the next stage, when the mind becomes sattvic through that practice, you're able to discriminate. I'm the witness. What's changing is the witnessed. I do nothing. It's what's appearing is doing all of the things. Then you're not the cause of any activity. Ma karma pala hetu bor. If you're not the cause of the activity, then you don't get the fruit of the activity. The self is unaffected by any action or the fruit of the action or the desire to do the action. All of that is not the self. So in the third stage, we have the discriminative wisdom that I do nothing. And then the fourth part of the verse says, but don't be attached to inaction. Even though I do nothing, this body will continue to be engaged in action, even though you know that you do nothing. Don't be attached to inaction, because inaction is another action. Saying I won't do anything depends on the agent. So don't be attached to inaction. In other words, the Gita teaching is not to renounce worldly activities and go live in a cave somewhere. The Gita teaching is to engage in the action in two stages. The first stage of karma yoga is to give up the attachment to the fruit. The next stage is to give up our attachment to the whole doer, doing, and done. That they just appear in the waking. I appear like I'm a doer, there's doing and the results. In the dream, I'm a dream doer, the dream actions, the dream results. But that consciousness does nothing. Then you're not the cause of any action and you don't get the fruit of any action. Now you're freed from the bondage of karma. The first stage just frees you from the sukhi dukhi mind. But now you're freed from the mind itself. That's the third. And then the reminder, but that doesn't mean that, then I won't act. The wise man has nothing to gain by action or inaction. Even while he's acting, he does nothing. Karmani abhivrito api. Even while engaged in action, whether he's a monk washing his clothes or he's a householder dealing with his worldly responsibilities, his knowledge has burnt up all actions. That's called the freedom from the bondage of karma. So he teaches him this trick of karma yoga, that merely by stopping action, you won't attain actionlessness. But if you perform it like this, you'll be freed from the bondage of karma. That's the secret of the Bhagavad Gita, by the way. My contention is there's no other spiritual, philosophical, religious text that teaches this idea, how to make the unavoidable feeling that I'm the agent, that I'm the doer, how to make that idea into a spiritual sadhana so that you'll be freed from all karma. Because as long as I...
What happened here? What happened? Wait, we lost Ira. Oh dear. Wait, oh, let me stop the recording. Wait a minute.